Hello, hello. So I'm looking at the chat right now. Can folks hear me? This is Omid. Cool, getting some yeses. So as folks are getting familiar with that chat, take note that by default, or actually not by default, when you chat, it's going to go just to me, folks who are hosts. When you want to share your chat with everyone, there's a little drop down that will allow you to say all panelists and attendees. We're going to be asking some questions today, so when we ask folks to share out with the group, take a note at that. If everyone is hearing us audio-wise, that is great. Can everyone see the screen? Can everyone see the screen that says Washington Race Equity Justice Initiative? Awesome, everyone's there. So go ahead, test that chat box. We have Ada and Jaffe on the line as well. So I'm gonna see if we can test her tech too.
Can you hear me? I'm here.
Ada, I can hear you. Can everyone else
Great.
hear Ada? Awesome. Great. So we can all hear each other. Ada, whenever you would like, you can share your video too, but we can all hear you.
Okay, great, thanks.
If there are any technical issues that folks have, just go ahead and ping on the chat box. Let me just confirm. Okay, that's what we're seeing right there. Cool. Now I can see what everyone else can see. So hello, everyone. My name is Omid Bagheri, Director of Equity and Community Partnership with Just Lead Washington, and I'll let my co-conspirator introduce themselves.
All right, hello everyone. I'm KJ Williams, Diversity Program Manager for the State Bar Association.
Awesome. And Ada, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. This is Ada and Jaffe. I'm so excited to see so many people signed on to this webinar. And I work with Omid and also KJ and Jen on the Race, Equity, and Justice Initiative, as well as Just Lead's Equity and Justice Community Leadership Academy. It's great to see you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Ada. And yes, Jennifer Worthell's also here. She'll be responding to some chats, some questions along the way, but will also be chiming in. And when she does so, she can introduce herself at that point as well. Jennifer Wardell is the Executive Director of Just Lead Washington. Also, all of us are co-conspirators with each other, and hope you all will be too with our topic today. So just a little overview of what we're going to get into. Our topic today is creating an equitable organizational culture. For folks who are familiar with REJI, you'll see that this is something similar to what the Race and Equity Justice Initiative, REJI for short, has focused on with its toolkit, which we'll talk about briefly. That toolkit talks about a lot of different dimensions of what that race equity work looks like. We have other webinars that touch on those as well, and other webinars forthcoming, but we're going to focus on that equitable organizational culture today. So again, just high level, what we're going to get into, although we'll reserve any remaining time at the end for question and answers. We also invite folks to send in your questions along the way. Our goal today will be to make this conversational as we get into this. So for folks who haven't already noticed, on their little toolbar, there should be, you'll see it alongside the chat icon, there's a Q&A icon too, which you can share your questions anonymously or non-anonymously as you wish. And that'll be the way we'll be able to track specific questions, but feel free to share anything else in the chat box too. Sounds like everyone got some folks joining and everything's working. Cool, so let us jump in a little bit with some more introduction. So part of this context, both REJI, Just Lead, part of our other co-conspirators is the Alliance and the Access to Justice Board. And some of that work and the context of that is we're working on building more awareness and some action against the racialized systems within the law and justice system in particular. So these are the Access to Justice Board state plan goals. And there's a lot here, everything from systemic advocacy to client-centered services. But again, you know, part of REJI's work, Just Lead's work, is goal number 1, race equity. So when we talk about our topic today, but with any of the work, talk about what is that role of race equity playing here today? And really, on the other hand, what role, how is racism operating here? Because part of that acknowledgement of goal number 1, part of REJI's work as well is accepting and acknowledging that we are living in a racialized society, that structural racism does exist and it is affecting our work in some way. So we first ask that question, how is racism operating here? But also thinking about what role can each of us play, our organizations play? And that's really where the REJI, Race and Equity Justice Initiative, comes in, because it talks about that vision that is free from bias, systemic unfairness, and oppression, specifically racial oppression, but also that really centers our work about ending historic and status quo patterns that we're seeing of racism operating at a systemic, societal, individual, interpersonal, organizational, community levels, which we're going to get into. Some of you know about REJI just for being a partner. If folks are interested in REJI, in being a REJI partner, what that means, our contact information will be at the end of this slide. And so you can definitely reach out to me for more info on that, because we are a growing building community and we want to get folks more aligned to be able to do this work at their organizations. That toolkit I mentioned is specifically focuses on the organizational work. You'll see these other topics listed here, the second one of which is our topic for today, but we had a webinar that's available on demand and free about securing an organizational commitment, and that's board work, that's folks in positional authority, and so forth, but also external work like developing accountability and partnerships with communities of color and applying that anti-racism work to programs, advocacy, decision-making, and so forth. So that toolkit is available. It will have more in addition to what we're going to talk about today. So that is a resource for everyone to take a look at and stay connected with myself and others. So racial equity, you know, we think it's important to define it, so we're not leaving anyone behind when we say racial equity. What does that really mean? So we're talking about when race no longer determines one's outcomes. So the racial equity is not only a point that we're working towards, but racial equity is also about the proactive reinforcement of maintaining that point of equity. So how can we maintain equitable power, access to opportunities and treatment, and be impact conscious in our work? So when race no longer plays that outcome, that's when we reach equity, but it also requires the constant investment in maintaining and building a new normal, a new status quo that in itself supports racial justice work and does not undermine it at its status quo. So that's what we mean by race equity. And racial equity also is not independent of other oppressions. It invites and includes an intersectional analysis with gender, sexual orientation, absolutely intersects with class, and understanding that all this work is intersects with each other, but we know that race compounds other oppressions. And so we center that in our work, but we also invite other systems of oppression as well into that work. So these 5 levels, these are the 5 levels of race equity work. You'll see in the middle, we have organizational, institutional. That's going to be our focus for today. But if you're familiar with the toolkit, if you're familiar with race equity work, you know that all of these levels come up and all of them are important. So we know that interpersonal individual work is a part of the organizational work. We're definitely going to talk about that today, and it definitely intersects with this little blue blob on the right is a brain, aerial brain. And that also speaks to the internalized racism and implicit biases that we have when it comes to race and racism. And so all of these circles, all these levels intersect with each other. It is all part of that organizational work to understand how we're doing work at each of these levels, can help us ground us in, you know, when we're engaging in certain kinds of work, what level is this operating from, and being clear on when that work is organizational and when it's not community and when it's not systemic. You know, our end game here ultimately is to change and transform systems, but all these levels of work kind of intersect with that as well. I'll take some pauses in between my talking, just in case others want to jump in, because I'm on a roll right now, as folks can see. So what is organizational culture? We want to define that as well for folks. Organizational culture is specifically these spoken and unspoken rules that we're all adopting by. They obviously get affected by the larger systems and society, societal norms, unspoken and spoken, that we operate within as well. But these spoken and unspoken norms, beliefs, values, all these expectations and assumptions largely that we often maybe implicitly act on, in some ways explicitly, because it's business as usual. And we often see organizational culture and norms really get amplified by folks in positional authority and folks in leadership positions in general. So really that gets into something we're going to talk about today about, you know, one of the reasons why working on organizational culture is hard is because of how it gets amplified by folks in positional authority and so forth.
Yeah, I can add something there.
Cool.
All right, so I think one thing to add that I feel is important is a recognition that the norms, beliefs, values, and expectations and all those assumptions that are held, that they work to either validate or invalidate an individual's ability to obtain access, to be up-leveled, to be an influencer, and I think at the end of the day, to really be recognized as someone who is a part of the in-group versus someone who has been othered. And it becomes extremely difficult to align yourself with organizational culture when you are a member of one of the underrepresented, marginalized, or oppressed groups. And so recognizing even that if you happen to be part of one of those groups, or you self-identify with one of those groups, but you've been able to find a way to align yourself with the dominant majority, that being more of the white culture, that even when you've been able to do that, you're not really a part of that in-group. And so you may have been accepted because you've been able to comply with the norms, with the beliefs, with the values, and with the expectations. But the fact that those things exist at all as a requirement for you to be validated or for you to experience being valued as an individual is an incredible barrier, right? And it's one of the major issues to changing organizational culture or barriers.
So we want to start off with our first discussion question. We want to get folks, as they listen to us, as they're thinking about your own organizations, what values do you associate with an equitable organizational culture? That's the question. What values do you associate? And this could look different for a lot of different folks, but we want to get different thoughts from folks that you can share on the chat box. So go ahead and share what sort of values come up for you when you think about what an equitable organizational culture looks like. What does it feel like? If folks are needing a little a boost on what that, unpacking that question. All of these different questions can help really understand that. So if folks can share that on the chat box, we'll give 2 minutes for folks to think about that. and share out, and then we'll kind of come back together and build off what folks have shared. Awesome. We're getting some great responses. Folks should be able to see what everyone is sharing, but KJ and I will just highlight a few of them that we're seeing. Seeing a theme of transparency, clear and honest communication, in particular when it comes to folks in leadership positions. We're seeing, people of color and other folks of marginalized identities in positions of power themselves and a part of taking a leadership role in decision making. Respect. And sounds simple, but it is an important key aspect of doing this work, which is inherently humanistic with each other. I'm really being to celebrate all the different ways of approaching the work and the differences in a way that is complementary to each other.
Another trend is feeling valued, which is really important, right? You want to be able to walk into the door of your organization, regardless of who you are, regardless of your positionality within the organization, and have an overt sense of being valued as a staff person, as a participant, as someone invested in that organization.
One key one here, I think, is allowing and embracing mistakes. I think that's really key as well, because what we often see, in particular when it comes to those of marginalized identities, is the ability to make mistakes is different based on how you're racialized. So when we talk about the kind of grace or culture of appreciation that we might try and build or want to maintain, we see that get implemented differently based on who made the mistake or based on the behavior of one person versus the other, even if it's the same exact behavior. So that piece is really key as well.
Also seeing bringing your authentic self, and I saw this at least once, just the word empowering. And so when I saw that and I think about how that connects to being able to bring your authentic self, if you think about what it means for you to step into the door of your organization and be your whole self, whatever that means for you, part of that means if you are being your whole self, then you feel empowered. You feel empowered to say the things that need to be said, to navigate your environment without fear, to give feedback, to receive feedback, and to know that the organization won't engage in any type of retaliation, right? And that's not just for the empowerment that comes with open communication, meaning you have stated what your beliefs are and your values, and maybe they're in contradiction to someone else in the organization. It's also this realization that when you are being authentic, that authenticity means that you naturally may not be aligned with the mannerisms, with the behaviors, with the standards of expectations that exist currently within the organization. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to bring your authentic self. That doesn't mean that you should not engage in empowering activities, because part of being able to do that is the process of organizational change as well, albeit at the individual and interpersonal level.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and move on. We're going to have more questions for folks. So, you know, part of the REJI toolkit, we have a non-comprehensive set of questions, but nonetheless questions that really get at a lot of what folks were speaking of. So we talk about what is an equitable organizational culture. I think everything folks shared is absolutely in line with what that is, because we all know what those feelings are, right? But we're working on being impact conscious of each other and understanding how racism is operating in our workplace, so we can move against that. So when we in the toolkit are talking about that, well, we're going to highlight some of these a little bit. So for example, the organization creates space for discussing issues of race and racism in ways that are relevant to the work. And so often what we see is, racial anxiety when racism comes up. We see taboo. It's seen as a taboo subject, so those conversations aren't had. And that's racial anxiety from white folks who feel like they're going to immediately be seen as racist, and people of color have racial anxiety for feeling like they have to speak on behalf of their entire communities, or walking on eggshells because they are aware of the stereotypes that are placed onto their own communities, and fear of playing into a stereotype regardless of how they're feeling. So when we talk about creating space for discussing issues of race and racism, these are ways we can reduce racial anxiety. And we're going to touch on that a little bit with the role of racial affinity caucusing as well.
Also, something to consider when we're discussing the organization creating space. In an equitable organization, that means that anyone in the organization has the opportunity to feel empowered to create that space. And so that may mean that, staff management, mid-level staff, direct service staff, maybe they are the ones who have formulated a great idea on how to engage in discussions around race and racism. And so in an equitable organization, they would have the freedom to do that. And their movements, their discussions would not be seen or experienced as threatening, because in an equitable organization, there is a recognition that you are facilitating the progress and the growth of the organization from both ends. That means from the bottom up and top down.
KJ, we got one question from someone on one thing you said. And the question for folks is, KJ was speaking on the empowerment piece. So the question was, do you think that empowerment piece applies to people who identify with the dominant culture?
Well, I'm not quite sure how the question is being framed, so I'll take a stab at it, and if I don't get to it or I'm not clear, just clarify that for us. I would say that in an equitable organization, everyone, regardless of any diversity dimensions or characteristics, should feel empowered to speak, should feel empowered to navigate the environment without fear of retaliation or some other types of oppressive or marginalizing responses. Now, at the same time, recognizing that because of the culture that we live in, which is the white dominant paradigm, we know that often our white colleagues may innately feel as though they already have the empowerment necessary to speak, right? Whereas a person of color or someone from an underrepresented group may need to do more work internally and may need to do work externally in terms of talking to advocates and allies in order to engage in the type of conversations and behavior that they find necessary, pushing towards equity. And so I'm not sure if I got at that question very well, but please hit us back and let me know.
Awesome. So on the Q&A in the chat. Cool. We got another question as well. And this question says, for organizations that are highly hierarchical, creating an equitable culture can be challenging. For example, in a law firm, is it even possible to have an equitable culture within hierarchy? Well, one, I don't think there's a short and sweet answer to this one. And I also think it requires understanding that there's multiple things happening at once and building our capacity to hold those multiple things. So for example, an equitable culture like the values that folks just shared, that should be something that should be possible regardless of where you are. These are values that allow us to feel centered and grounded and connected with each other to do that work. Specifically within hierarchy, what we've seen very hierarchical organizations not be conducive to some of those values that folks shared. So we live in a hierarchical society. Those things are not going away. But the question is, can we work towards those values? Can we be in relationship with each other and have conversations with each other to be able to have difficult conversations and also create an equitable space for one another? So to that, I say yes, but it's a both and to that question. And I don't know, KJ has some thoughts on that.
I have a little bit. I would say yes, it's entirely possible, and it is only possible when you have complete, consistent, and transparent involvement and investment from the top. And that's imperative, because while you can move whatever the agenda is towards equity from the grassroots or through the grassroots effort, you can only get to a certain point. You generally are going to need investment, and I'm specifically saying transparent investment, right? Not leaders who are hiding behind the curtain and yet telling staff that I'm on your side. You need clear, consistent, and outward investment from the top down. And that's going to be required because the level of change that's necessary in a hierarchy context is complex. I think about being in the military and what it would take to actually change the military from the inside out. The level of buy-in, the structural changes that need to be modified, the processes, the systems. You're talking about a complete and total overhaul in some cases, depending upon the organization. But it definitely can be done, and it can be done most effectively when those at the top and those who are actively involved at the grassroots level recognize that it's not a short journey, and that there are going to be a lot of ebbs and flows and ups and downs on this progress and on this journey towards becoming a more equitable organization, but it can be done.
Awesome.
One other question about whether it's different for volunteer-based organizations. I think this change.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, does it make a difference if the organization is volunteer-based?
I'd say the short answer is no. I think there's some unique challenges when you're working with folks on a volunteer basis. Yet I think those same challenges, I think, can be overcome with the same sort of values, with the same sort of centering what is really at stake and and the principles of being able to do race equity work on an organizational wide level. I think the volunteer aspect of the work is definitely something to think about, but part of that work is understanding where can we identify those unique challenges and be able to bring that over and create a culture that our volunteers can adopt and be brought into.
I would add that with a volunteer-based organization, depending on the organization, you do have a little bit more flexibility in that if primarily the folks running the organization are volunteers, then you have this incredible opportunity to develop volunteer job descriptions that are specific to race equity, that are specific to outlining the values and the cultural norms that volunteers are expected to engage in and to help build, whereas in an organization that is primarily staff driven, people are invested because we're also talking about, you know, needing to make a living, whereas volunteer based, you're going to find a higher percentage of individuals involved based on their passion and their desire to see change or their desire to do something positive. And so often that just provides a little bit more flexibility in terms of facilitating change.
Awesome. Ada, you had something to share as well.
Yeah, hi everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about the hierarchy question. All of us working in law and justice and the equity and justice community are in the belly of the beast of the ultimate hierarchy status quo maintainer in our society. So I want to tell you this little story, which is other people know about, but it's a really good example of what you can do. So a number of years ago, ICE agents were in the King County courthouse and in the courtrooms, and two of our justices of color, who were still Superior Court judges at the time, reached out because they were so discouraged that when they took the position that ICE agents being in the courtroom and the courthouse were a direct deterrent to especially communities of color coming forward, and led to a climate where people just didn't feel that they could get justice. And so they had suggested a rule that ICE couldn't come into their courtrooms and also to the courthouse. And at that time, the presiding judge, who has long since retired, apparently, I only heard this third hand, but I heard it from 3 different people, said, "We are law enforcement. ICE agents are our brothers and sisters, and we need to help them enforce the law," which wasn't a satisfactory answer to the 2 judges of color. And so one of them approached me and said, "I'm so disgusted and discouraged that I'm ready to quit." And I said, "I can't tell you whether quit or not quit, but I can tell you that if you can organize a body politic of accomplices, that you can push back against this and at least give it a try." And so we had a discussion about what that would mean. And I said, "Can you identify 3 to 5 white colleagues on the bench who you think could be persuaded to agree with your position?" And they said, "Sure." So I said, "So go have coffee with each of these people and organize into a body politic of 7, and then draft a rule and work it, have all those 4 or 5 other people work it with their white colleagues, and then bring it up again." So that's what they did, and they got a wonderful supportive vote to pass a rule that the ICE agents couldn't be in the courtrooms and they couldn't be in the courthouse. So that's an example of using what I guess I would call semi-guerrilla tactics. And whether you're in a law firm or a law school or an equity and justice organization, it doesn't really matter, because law and hierarchy go hand in hand. So insurrectionist guerrilla tactics are necessary if you're going to try to deal with hierarchy. That's the only way. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you,
Thank
Ada.
you.
So jumping back to our slides here, the next aspect of what an equitable organizational culture looks like could be that the organization encourages and makes racial competency trainings available on an ongoing basis to staff, board, and volunteers. So again, we talked about building a culture that talks about race and racism, that centers it, that goes hand in hand with any conversations about professional development, leadership development. These things should be seen together, because what we ultimately know is none of the work that we do, regardless of our positions, operates independent of these systems of oppression, and particularly the racial oppression. So where we can center that into our work and understand that folks have, each of us have ongoing learning to do, is important, and I think is a part of the culture to prioritize offering and encouraging folks to have those opportunities to build up their racial competency. And obviously, when you talk about staff, board, and volunteers, unique challenges for each of those. We talked a little bit about volunteers, especially is the case with doing work with boards and for them to understand their role as well, and then certainly at the staff level.
I'm looking at it.
So we have also that there's an understanding of the impact of and need to address the cultural, institutional, and structural racism to advance racial equity with the board, the staff, the volunteers, organizational partners, allies, and of course, community supporters and local donors. So, you know, for building up that racial competency, we have to build up our capacity to take action as well, and understand that work, the culture as an organization that we want to embody, has to go into our board, staff, volunteers, yes, but it also needs to come into what we're expecting with the folks we work with, and folks who are allies or accomplices really in this work. And as well, an accountability to community supporters, but also to understand that that's the culture we want to take out to our local donors and funders as well.
So I would add to that even going back to the making racial competency trainings available, that these trainings and this understanding around the impact and need to address these issues needs to be ongoing. So if you think about how your organization currently facilitates its onboarding process, it's very easy bringing someone in the door for the first time to give them a base level understanding around racial equity, right? But how do you ensure that they're on a track of progressive learning, which allows them to be successful within their position, but also to become more acclimated to the overall values and goals of the organization? So when you're thinking about the development of those racial competency trainings, we're not talking about that one-time shot, right? And understanding that you're going to have individuals and staff at different levels. So you need that onboarding process, but then you need that progressive learning. And as a part of that, how do you understand, how do you ensure that your organization is continuing to learn? So recognizing the need for surveys and for consistent feedback so that you are identifying any gaps in the learning and understanding and awareness building continuum, and then developing the content necessary and the tools and strategies necessary to address those gaps so that the organization is continuing to grow. Even as it's bringing in new staff, it's growing both horizontally as well as laterally, right? Depth and height.
Awesome.
There's a question coming in about examples of organizational work with donors on racial equity.
Organizational work with, so what is the question?
Do you have any examples of an organization's work with donors on racial equity?
Yeah, if you have a thought.
My example is not professional.
I'm not allowed to share.
Oh.
You want to come switch real quick?
No. Yes, I'll spot my head. I'll awkwardly stand behind. See how things. Hi, Jen Bordeaux. I prefer being behind the scenes, but it's a really great question to ask about how organizations or individuals can engage their donors on racial equity work, and just kind of thinking about the donor group as a stakeholder in this really organizational wide work. And that's a really tough question because we don't feel like we have as much flexibility, and it can feel very risky to have difficult conversations with donors. And so a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is that, like any other work, just being able to articulate it from a values-based standpoint. If you're really clear and are able to articulate your strategic intent around racial equity, here's what our organization is about, and here's the work we're doing, and we're really excited about it. In the same way you would talk about any other piece of your mission and the work that you're doing. Hopefully you're able to generate that same kind of excitement with your donors as you would with any other stakeholder group. Also, similarly, often the one-on-one conversations and really engaging folks, as Omid, you were saying, at the humanistic level. I can think of an example where we were just trying to model the equity work that we were and the approach that we were taking as we were in conversation with one of our individual donors, and just really talking with authentic passion about what kind of transformational change we were seeing at our own organization and among some of the program participants we were working with, and they just got really excited, and to the point where they started talking about, what are ways in which they can engage in this work in their own circle of philanthropic foundations and other donors. So I think it is possible. And I think the other piece of this work that is particularly challenging is just thinking about different and more equitable development and fundraising structures generally. Like I, for example, worked in an organization that was really awkward that I'm squatting.
I told you.
Worked in an organization that was very mission driven and was a social justice organization who was doing a lot of traditional fundraising style events. They were trying to court donors in a very traditional sort of, dominant culture. Like, we're going to have a luncheon and we're going to target as many high value potential participants as we can, and they weren't seeing a lot of success in it, and it opened the conversation and up in the organization to be thinking about really needing to completely dismantle and rethink who they're trying to engage, why and how, and whether the ways in which they were reaching donors was in line with their values and their commitment to equity, and changed a lot, including things like sharing proceeds, doing a less traditional event. The proceeds they were bringing in, they were sharing out with other community partners, and just making some real structural and sort of radical changes to how they were approaching fundraising to begin with.
I would add to that that I'm just thinking about an organization, a nonprofit that I worked in some years ago that made an intentional move towards becoming more racially equitable. And so I think what's been said earlier about, helping to inspire the passion of your individual donors, I would go a step further in that when we're doing individual donor development and we are having those initial conversations and we're making those notes that are necessary to understanding what is it that drives the passion of this particular donor, what are they invested in, what excites them. And so when you can connect that and make a bridge towards racial equity, then you already have them. Like, you have them at the anchor because you're dealing with their initial passion. And when you create that bridge, you take their initial passion and you connect it directly to racial equity. If you're able to do that, then you are going to have a donor who is not just excited, but more than likely in it for the long term. In addition to that, be prepared for those donors that say, we don't want to go in this direction. We had that happen in our organization. So as you're developing a plan, institute as a part of that plan, a backup plan and a backup plan, right? Because if your top 3 donors decide that this is not the game that they're interested in being a part of anymore, what are you going to do? And so when you have that backup plan and it's solid, and you feel confident in it, you can go into those conversations without feeling as though you have to compromise or negotiate the organization's values, and even your own individual values and beliefs in that dialogue, with trying to move them towards understanding and remaining invested.
And I just want to touch on a follow-up question that came up about, ultimately the power dynamics, the racial power dynamics that play out, and all these different things that Jen and KJ were talking about. So in addition to what they were talking about what those, approaches, those tactics could look like, I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that when we're talking about power, we see where power is cultivated, and we do not see it in the communities. We see it for those who have access to resources that includes donors and funders. So inherently in doing this work and disrupting those dynamics requires us to go against the grain. It requires us to center our values, lead with our values and what's most important, to talk about it, to name it, first of all, and bring folks together and analyze it together. It inherently requires pushing against and being a leader and bringing folks along. That is the tough part of the work, is also the worthwhile part of the work. But disrupting those dynamics starts with naming it, yes, but it also requires actually knowing that you will be moving against the grain. But in addition to what folks have shared, just knowing that and alone is challenging those power dynamics, is challenging the status quo where power is ultimately inequitably held and not shared. So for the sake of time, we're gonna move along just to keep things flowing. When we talk about the cultural norms of the organization, we talked about those spoken, unspoken, those rules, those norms. And so part of that is being able to openly discuss and address those quote unquote norms. Having a culture to understand that every organization does have an organizational culture, and there are spoken and unspoken rules that are playing out. So being able to openly discuss those and address them, and understand how those are impacting folks in the space. We have that the organization encourages ideas, strategies, initiatives, and feedback from all stakeholders of the organization. So we're talking about volunteers, as we talked about earlier. We're definitely talking about frontline staff who oftentimes have the most face-to-face direct interaction with the community and are bringing that perspective, a really valuable perspective. And of course, we're talking about clients and folks who represent the clients' communities that we are serving, and that includes community organizations and groups that already have established relationships in those communities, and that we can build partnerships with as well, who already have that lived experience and that perspective that we don't often have in the space. But engaging all those folks and encouraging and building relationships with those folks, so it's a two-way conversation, is really important. And that is regardless of where the positional authority is held by different stakeholders. It's ultimately important to bring in all these different perspectives as part of that conversation. We have staff, leadership, volunteers who identify as people of color or with other marginalized groups who feel they can bring their full identities to the workplace if they choose, so they can feel recognized, respected, and have their input taken into account to shape the culture. Folks who have that understanding, that lived experience of what an equitable culture looks like and feels like, are the best, who have the best perspective to shape what that equitable organizational culture should look and feel like. Everyone plays a role in creating that organizational culture, but if there is someone who is speaking to some aspect of the organization that doesn't allow them to bring their full identities to the workplace, it doesn't allow them to feel recognized and respected, that cannot be brushed aside. That is an important aspect of what the conversation and the path forward should look like and needs to look like. So how do we get there? We've touched on some aspects as well, but we want to unpack that a little bit, a little further.
So lateral and horizontal investment, we've already talked about this a little bit. You need investment from the top, from the bottom, from across the organization. And I would say that the road to that investment can be pretty challenging, depending upon the culture of the organization. If there's a culture of fear where people are afraid to speak truth, and people are afraid to speak truth even amongst their peer groups, then you're going to have to start at a place where you are addressing the interpersonal dynamics in the organization before you can even get to actual investment towards an equitable organization. We have to be able to talk to one another. We have to be able to do more than just speak comfortably with our peer group, right? We need to be able to traverse positional, different positions within the organization so that we can galvanize and gather the type of investment that's necessary. And so when we're talking about lateral investment, we're including the board. So if your organization has a board of directors, it's important that that investment is starting there as well, because that's going to lead to alignment and congruency throughout the entire organization. And when we're talking about lateral, we're not just talking about across our peer groups. That lateral investment are our stakeholders as well. So you think about your organization being in the center, and just think about its sphere of influence. Just think about its sphere of influence. So this is a way to increase pressure, if you will, externally on the organization to move towards a more equitable or racially equitable organizational culture. I feel like I should have like 3 shots of coffee for trying to say that sentence that way. And then leadership with congruent language and behaviors. I mean, I think that is pretty straightforward. You want leaders who are congruent. They put their money where their mouth is. If there are policies in place, they actually apply those policies to themselves as well. And the behaviors that they example, the decisions that they make, they all represent an equitable organization, so that you're working in a place and reporting to leadership that is really authentic leadership, is leadership with integrity, written policies and best, well, let me stop. Do you want to add anything to that?
I know you're on the roll.
Okay. Written policies and best practices. You want an equitable organization, you want policies in place so that staff know how to navigate the environment. Too often in organizations, we have our policies in our minds. And really what that means is that we have some best practices, but we don't have anything written in policy that we can hold people accountable to. This is just the way that it's always been done. So if there are written policies, then you have a roadmap. If there is knowledge of best practices, then even those best practices should be written, right? Again, it's a roadmap. You want your staff, you want your employees to know how to navigate the environment, how to navigate the culture, what the expectations are, so that they are successful. Progressive accountability process. For me, I think this is a really big one because, over the last few years, as we've been talking about microaggressions and implicit bias, and as those things have pushed their way to the surface, what we find over and over again is that organizations are not necessarily historically set up to address those issues outside of a formal HR process. And so an equitable organization is going to equip its staff with the skills and the knowledge and strategies necessary to resolve conflict, to have difficult conversations at the lowest level possible. And that's all staff, right? From the top down, from the bottom up. And so a progressive accountability process would look something like, we're having a conversation because the culture has been established and allowed us to do that. And so Omid and I, let's say that we have some conflict because usually he's wrong and I've decided that I'm always right, okay? So And so we have this conflict. And instead of my going straight to my supervisor and lodging a complaint, or going straight to HR and lodging a complaint, albeit, let me be really clear, I'm talking about some low-level conflict, right? You haven't engaged in egregious behavior or anything that's overtly biased or discriminatory, okay? We just don't agree about the fact that I'm always right, okay? And so you stop responding to my emails. And so when we can engage in a conversation, because maybe we have a triangulation policy in place, that means that I am literally forced to develop some interpersonal skills so that I can have a conversation with Omid, right? And we can resolve this right here. If I don't have those skills, then I'm going to my supervisor, I'm going to HR, right? And so if Omid then does not want to respond to me, depending upon the process that's put in place, maybe the next thing is a conversation with both of our supervisors, and it's just a conversation. It's not, you know, this is going to be something that's written up, it's put in your personnel file. So thinking about a progressive accountability process where we're actually acknowledging the humanity of one another, and that we don't always wake up on the right side of the bed, and sometimes we just have bad days and those things get played out at work, and giving ourselves the opportunity to resolve those things so that we can maintain our professional relationships and grow those relationships is important. Relevant education and knowledge building continuum. This goes back to what I talked about earlier in recognizing that you can have a great onboarding process, but an organization that wants to reach the place of being more equitable and maintain itself as an equitable organization is going to need to engage in a continuum of education, and recognizing that staff come in at different levels, and that your managers and your supervisors, your directors may need a different level of education because of the scope of their work, that your board is going to need a different level of education because of the extent of their governance. You're going to look at all of the needs from your volunteer base to your board as a continuum, and to recognize that there are going to be multiple layers to that. Objective data collection, review, summary, and feedback. We use the word objective because it's important to bring in folks from the outside to help leadership and to help staff really understand the state of their organization. So you can engage in many of the efforts that we're talking about today as an organization, moving towards becoming more equitable. You know, we have the tendency as humans to do some navel gazing, right? We've been doing a great job, and we're getting great feedback from our staff, and that can go on for a couple of years, but it's really important to recognize that turnover changes the culture of the organization. As you become more diverse and demographically in your staffing, that changes the culture of the organization. And so it's important to bring in an outside consultant or group of consultants to do the data collection, to do the review, the summary, and the feedback, so that the organization then can take that information and put it back into the education and knowledge building continuum, so that they are educating the organization again on that progressive process. Want to add anything?
Keep going.
Okay. All right. The culture of adaptiveness and flexibility. So this builds on that objective data collection. So as an organization, now you have, because, you know, when you use a third party to come in and review and really analyze the state of your organization, you're more likely to have a higher percentage of staff who are going to participate in any type of survey or data collection. And that means that they're going to tell you the truth about what they like and what they don't like, who they like and who they don't like. This is where it's really important that the organization itself, especially its leadership, is able to example a level of maturity, because when you receive that feedback, often what we tend to do as humans is personalize it. And as soon as we personalize it, we create a barrier to really being open to whatever adaptivity should be required based on the feedback. And we create a barrier to our own flexibility. And that becomes problematic the more the more influence that we have in the organization, and the higher our positionality, right? That becomes a barrier. So maintaining that culture of adaptiveness and flexibility is important. And then the high integrity versus low integrity organization values and behavior. This really is about the leadership of the organization. And for me, and I will recommend an article that it's a few years old, but it's by Deloitte, and it is titled "Integrity in the Boardroom. What does it really mean?" It's a good overview document, but some of the things that it outlines as principles for improving integrity at the board level is being active. And that means that the board should be informed about the organization and vigorous in management oversight, providing organizational leadership, and doing that with a strategic direction, complying with laws, regulations, and ethic policies, be informed, be transparent, and listen, and engage in continuous monitoring. So many of the things that we've already listed and talked about, but recognizing that if the board is not operating at this level, it's less likely that the organization itself is operating with high integrity if your board is not.
Thank you, KJ. Broke it down so nicely. I couldn't agree more on all the ways you unpacked it. And one thing I was thinking about as you were talking was all these different opportunities that come up where we can intentionally build that organizational culture. And oftentimes we let them come and go, and we don't see those opportunities. I think the hiring, onboarding, and then a piece of it is a really great example. We talk on building that internal equitable culture internally, but it doesn't make it into our hiring, and so that's a missed opportunity. We're all these different ways, excuse me, that we don't allow the work that we're doing to actually penetrate all the different internal systems that we have. Each of these are opportunities, and they should be seen as such, to intentionally infuse the values, the race equity work, the equity work in general, into our how we operate, into our organization culture, those norms, those rules, and so forth. For the way we're gonna just doing a time check, let's focus on this question, and we want to hear from folks. We'll go through a few of the slides we have left, and then we'll just come back and we'll just keep the remaining time to be Q&A, conversational, just so we can move through these slides. So the question now for folks to share in their chat boxes, we talked about what is organizational culture, what does it look like, what does it feel like. KJ broke it down on all these different ways of how we get there. But we want to, acknowledge the fact that maybe this came up as people were listening to it, as all the barriers that that come up to institutionalize those values, to really build and move meaningfully forward on building that work, to create that equitable feeling and look in our organization. So when people think of that question, we'll spend just 2 minutes for folks to think about it and share in their chat boxes. What are those barriers, those pressures that come up that don't allow that work to happen? All right, so bringing it back, some really great responses and really big responses too that each could have their own webinar in itself. So just to highlight some that we're seeing, we're definitely seeing folks share, white fragility and internalized racism. So, talking about that racial anxiety again for folks who don't have a lived experiences of racism. And so being defensive as far as what oftentimes white folks respond with because of that fear, ultimately, that they've internalized that they will be seen as racist regardless of what they say because they don't have that lived experience. So that white fragility is just getting in the way, that defensiveness piece. There was one piece around really not really being able to want to take risks. So, and that could be for a myriad of reasons. Folks share that, it's holding on to power, it's fear of losing their jobs, all of that fear of the unknown that allows folks to maintain the status quo, intentionally or unintentionally. What are the themes are popping up for you?
Yeah, so a few people using different language, but believing that the organization is already equitable. And even with this idea of risk aversion, the thought that comes up for me is starting with a question, especially if you're having an individual conversation. Let's say it's your supervisor, it's your director. If they believe that the organization is already equitable, what's the evidence that that's what they believe? Do they believe that? Do you know that they believe that because of conversations that you've had with them? Or is it an evaluation or analysis of certain decisions or ways of engaging? And if there hasn't been a conversation, to take some time to reflect on a number of questions that you can ask around their belief that the organization is equitable, and that will allow you to respond with your perception of what's equitable and what's not. And in terms of that risk aversion, again, asking questions so that you can delve a little deeper into why an individual is unwilling to take a risk. And often if we can make the space and time to do that and build that level of trust in a relationship where we can get authentic responses in return, then we may be able to hear something that's being shared on the other side that they've not actually thought about. So I'm afraid of taking a risk because of XYZ, and maybe in that conversation you recognize that why is something that actually can be addressed, and so that risk can be lowered, but that requires building trust around those conversations. I think that's what I'm...
Awesome. What folks also were touching on is just a segue into their next piece. So I'm going to jump these questions. I'm actually even going to jump that one. I'm going to jump to here. So when we talk about white culture, we talk about white dominant culture. A lot of these pressures or barriers that folks touched on absolutely fit in to what we would call white dominant culture, white organizational culture. To be clear, a white culture could be perpetuated by anyone, regardless of your racial identity, because it is the dominant norm in the United States. When we talk about living in a race-constructed society, we're talking inherently about how the idea of whiteness is centered, is normalized, it is seen as normal. So that, in the way it enters into our white organizational culture, I like this definition of talking about what cultural white privilege is, and it's a set of dominant cultural assumptions about what is good, normal, or appropriate that reflects Western European white worldviews and dismisses or demonizes other worldviews. So when we talk about, for example, some of this list here are, I think, straightforward, but there's a few that folks touched on already, right? Where we talk about, ultimately what that fear is. We talk about defensiveness. We talked about, not having one folks shared like having a short-term view, not understanding what that long-term view is, which can be attached to the quantity over quality piece, right? We're talking about short-term wins, talking about getting the right numbers, but not talking about the quality of the relationships built, the quality of building towards our long-term vision. We're talking about either or thinking, not being able to understand there are multiple forces happening at once. You know, we live in a racist society, or we work in a racist organization, but we also are intentionally building and nurturing what an equitable anti-racist mission for our work is at the same time. This question, what characteristics have you seen play out in your organization, in your legal organization? This is an ongoing question you can take with you. You can understand how these dominant worldviews that get perpetuated through white culture, that doesn't acknowledge other ways of knowing, being, or approaching the work differently, can be barriers to ultimately get that work moving forward, because you're ultimately ignoring an entire section, entire community of folks who have perspectives that is not being centered, is not a part of the change. So I want to dive into one of these. Would you have any thoughts?
No, that's great.
Cool.
Yeah.
So for example, I want to talk about the fear of open conflict. So when we talk about the organizational change work, well, fear of open conflict, well, we often see, a person of color raising an issue that causes discomfort. And when we say causes discomfort, either people in power are uncomfortable or white people are uncomfortable. And the response oftentimes, unintentionally, intentionally, whatever, is to blame the person for raising that issue rather than looking at the actual issue that is being raised that is actually causing the problem. We go back to this quote about comfort is the enemy. That discomfort tells us that something's wrong, but really it just tells us that we're exploring new territory, that there's growth, and that we should keep following that discomfort. It brings in and centers the power dynamics that are playing out across the organization, across positional leaders, in particular with those who have agent identities. And what I mean by that is, if you identify as white, if you identify as a man, cisgender, heterosexual, middle income, high income, whatever those identities hold that often get perpetuated to be the dominant seen identity, oftentimes it becomes more challenging to handle those power dynamics. The fear of open conflict gets harder because folks who are in positions of power or who hold agent identities are not used to being uncomfortable. And so comfort as the enemy is a way to reframe that and think about, well, how is that playing in? And one thing we talked about earlier was the double standard that applies to when this different types of work is raised by a white person versus someone who's a marginalized entity or a person of color. So it oftentimes could even mean person of color said something, white person says it moments later, and then, oh, it's seen as a good idea, right? And it's overlooked the voice and perspective that was just shared by the other person. Part of that is respectability politics too. So we get into how the person said it and now, again, what they're actually saying. So this piece of how white culture can get in the way of us doing this organizational change work is really important. And in particular with the fear of open conflict, ultimately we cannot be scared of that conflict or ignore it. It will only fester. And in fact, we actually have to name it, address it, embrace it, because that's where the growth is and that's where the change comes in. But a lot of that requires all those values we talked about, all these different, strategies and tactics of how we get there that KJ broke down. All of that is happening at once. It's not one or the other, but we need to be able to build our analysis to be able to have deeper, stronger conversations with each other. Yeah.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would add is that from the first bullet, this idea around discomfort, just wanting to highlight that the feelings of discomfort are also this opportunity that reveals an opportunity for group growth, right? It's an opportunity, which means it's a choice point. And so if a person of color is going to raise an issue that they suspect is going to be uncomfortable for whoever that person is as an agent, I would recommend, and this is because of self-care, the need for self-care, especially for people of color and those in underrepresented groups, to do what you can to assess the individual's ability to have an uncomfortable conversation about anything before you're diving into dialogue around something that's race-based. Because if we can't engage, so let's just say, if I can't engage with Jen, and she's my supervisor and she presents as a white woman, if I can't engage with her about you know, the color pins that we are using, right? Or the email signature block. Like, we can't even have a minimal disagreement without Jen then deciding she's not going to talk to me in meetings, or, you know, she refuses to send me important emails, then I certainly am not going to engage in a dialogue around racial equity and those things that are necessary to reach that place. So that's just really for those people of color and those who are in underrepresented groups, self-care when you're engaging in these dialogues.
And I just want to plug that this list of white culture is from an article that folks maybe have seen, and was kind of curated from a lot of different work happening in the community. Communities of color who have, again, been doing this work. You know, just this morning we were talking about how, you know, we often can feel like we're late to doing this work, but often many folks in our society are late to doing this work, and folks who have been who are organizing in their communities of color have been doing this work for generations and so forth. So, you know, so for example, the People's Institute for Northwest Survival and Beyond, they are a local organization, anti-racist community organizers, people of color led, who have been doing this work, talking about what it means to undo institutionalized racism. They're active here in the Pacific Northwest. This list and another resource in the community are curated from that work. And so I just want to plug that to acknowledge that, you know, all of us are coming into this work where we are. There are resources out there. There are communities of color who are doing this work, and building partnerships and acknowledging that work is key, and is a key part of how to enter into this work, to really to bring in those different perspectives, including, you know, the work, any work that any of us do, regardless of position, and include myself in that. It's ultimately about, you know, shifting those norms, and those norms mean centering folks who have been most impacted by structural racism, and oftentimes there are communities of color who have built a network, built a community, and who are pushing this work, not just to undo these systems, but to ultimately humanize themselves and folks who look like them and are marginalized similarly. Yeah, and your video should work now.
Yes, I see you. Closer so you can hear me. So I just wanted to, we don't have time to really go into it, but wanted to flag this idea of seeing all these different levels of types of fear. And we've certainly dug into a lot of them. We don't have time to go into others, but just wanted to highlight a couple, because I think we've certainly talked about fear of open conflict and racial anxiety. I think another couple of things that make this work really hard are fear of change at all, and sort of knowing that the kind of work we're talking about, you know, the list that KJ and Omid are walking through, right? Changing organizational culture really means changing everything about the ways in which we do business, and the ways in which we operate with one another as human beings, and the way in which our businesses operate. And so it is big, and any sort of organizational change is really hard and really complicated. And then the other level of fear that I think operates, particularly for folks like me in positional authority, right, and I'm also part of a white dominant culture, is fear of what we must give up. And if we talk about sharing power or giving, there's a sense that we sort of have to give something up in order to let other people take power, or shared power, or, you know, how our decisions are made, and whether, you know, thinking through whether we have to give up our roles in order to create space. There's a lot of fear about, well, what will happen to me, and what does it look like if we approach a new and different working environment which you've never seen before. So there's a lot of fear attached to that too. Just wanted to highlight this.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of a quote, and I do not know where this quote originated, so if folks know, please let me know. But it's the general idea that power and a dominant norm often sees power as something that is finite. So there's fear of losing it, but in fact, it's infinite. And for us to understand to share that power and shift power ultimately to folks who have been most impacted, that part is really key. And so to embody that in our work is just a quote I leave with you all, because I think it's really important to reflect on ourselves. Do we feel like power is finite or is it infinite? To do this work, to really drive it, it has to be seen as something that is infinite and that we can all live in an equitable society. One last tool we want to plug is the idea of an affinity group or racial caucusing. This is a way to, one, reduce racial anxiety that we talked about. So to create the different spaces for both white people and people of color to have these conversations. It's a way to create space in your organization to talk about these, with opportunities to come together as well. And that work looks different as well, ultimately, for those who identify as people of color and for those as white people. For white people, it's working through what it means to be a white person who is doing this work, and to also acknowledge the fact that white folks have work to do themselves, and it's not on the burden of people of color to educate or teach them to do that, and that for them to take responsibility to do that work that could happen in a space that really allows them to explore all the different experiences that come with having holding a white identity. I won't go through all of these, but for people of color, it's really creating that power base, that counter space for people of color who are often, if not every day, walking in white dominant spaces. It's to build relationships and support through each other, understand that we're all going through similar different things, different as in, you know, we all come with our different racial identities as people of color as well, and to ultimately retreat from the quote unquote white gaze, be able to have a different kind of conversation with each other, to be able to really center our own lived experiences in that work.
And so I have a few thoughts specific to people of color. I think that it is incredibly important that if we are going to talk about and address experience of racism, that we also talk about and address our experiences of colorism within our own communities, the experience of underrepresented and marginalized groups being pitted against one another, those things that have been internalized in terms of resentment between races. If we can't have those conversations within our people of color caucus groups, then what, in my opinion, what we've done is we then have diluted our power, our collective power in being able to strategically and collectively respond to the white dominant majority. And so I think it's very important that people of color begin to address those issues, those in-group issues and those I always get it mixed up, inter or intra-group issues that exist within the people of color power base.
And, you know, one thing I want to say for white folks who are listening to this and wondering, you know, why are we separating ourselves out? Well, the truth is we have already separated ourselves out. Society and organizations often have been split that way. Caucusing is intentionally acknowledging that and also creating a different kind of conversation in the name of anti-racism, whereas when we were splitting ourselves up before, we were doing it in the name of racism, because that is the dominant practice of our society. And so, you know, when we talk about, you know, some of those different things, you know, part of it is taking the responsibility to own this work for yourself and what it means. And if you're, another question that often is posed by white folks is, well, how do we learn ultimately? It's like, well, there are people of color who have written books, who have put things online. You can pay for those folks who have decided to share their lived experiences for folks to understand and consume. There are educational resources out there. It requires doing that work for yourself, Googling it if you are able, what have you. But those resources are out there. But again, it's to understand that all these things are already happening in society, so we're intentionally creating space to talk about them. So we have, it's 1:27 right now. We would wrap up at 1:30. We always say we can stay a little longer, 5-10 minutes, probably max, if there's interest to stay. But really, we just want to open up to any Q&A that folks have. You know, there was one question that got posed earlier as well that I really think is a question for the group. And that question was, are we willing as a community to turn down donors who do not align with our topic today, especially those in a legal system with lots of power and resources? And that's really a question I'm putting out for everyone, because are we willing to do that is really acknowledging the fact that we do all have power if we come together, if we can all become aligned and operate with a shared vision. So I want to leave that with folks as they're percolating that, but also maybe take another question here, which is, how do you get elected officials to see racial equity as priority, especially when you live in community where minorities don't have the numbers to vote them out of power, and the dynamics of living in rural communities in our state, which is overbearing? Great question. No short and sweet answer. I think for folks, regardless of who you're engaging with, for folks who do not have a lived experiences of racism, part of it, and I think a key part of it is being able to bridge those empathy gaps with folks to understand those different perspectives, and to remind them that even in rural communities, yes, it may be overwhelmingly white, we often see, and that's definitely the case in different parts of Washington State. But there is also a reason they are overwhelmingly white. These things did not happen intentionally. You know, in urban areas, we can see where there's segregation, but there's also that playing out in rural communities where we've seen intentional acts of structural racism that have segregated communities. And oftentimes we don't know where the people of color are in our communities. It's because we don't have relationships with them, we don't engage them, we don't have partnerships with them. And so I think part of that work is understanding that if you, based on values, if you do want to include everyone in your community, or you are wanting to reach, you know, a goal of, let's say, providing a good wage or jobs or employment for those in your community, it's part of it is making the case that you can't actually do that if you do not include everyone in that conversation. So being able to make those points, I think, is part of the work, and it's part of building up the relationships, both with those who are in your community of marginalized identities of people of color, but also building relationships with those elected officials, because to do that work, it's going to happen through relationship building. It's not going to happen by only maybe some rabble rousing and some troublemaking, which we definitely need. We want folks to do, but also requires that relationship building and understanding that work can happen by having those conversations, meaningful conversations with those who are in any position of power, but particular with elected officials.
The only thing that I would add to that is that it's really helpful to have the perspective of organizing, educating, and speaking. So in those communities, especially that are rural, organizing takes on can take on a different look, because there's going to be travel involved, right? Things are spaced out more. But what you want to do is you want to organize cross-culturally. And by cross-culturally, we're talking all the diversity dimensions. We're not just looking at race. You want to build your base as broad and deep as you possibly can. And you want to educate people in the community. And you use grassroots efforts to organize, and recognizing that, generally speaking, rural communities or lower income. And so ensuring that the method that you use to provide education actually meets people where they're at so that they can make the connection more easily, right? Because they may feel as though they have nothing, they have no skin in the game. And then in terms of speaking, whenever we're talking about trying to change a politician's mind or to move legislation forward, it's important to recognize that often this is a long drawn out process, that you may be able to put language in a particular bill this time, but maybe that gets striked out. And so you may go through 3, 4, 5 iterations, but the key is the more you speak, the more you provide opportunities for knowledge and education, the more awareness you're going to raise around the particular issue and the goal that you've set. And as you raise education and awareness within the community, then that politician becomes more influenced and has to respond to that at some level. Awesome, folks. So that, I think we'll wrap up, and I just want to leave you with a few different things as you leave. In particular, this last comment from another co-conspirator we have, SV Borboa from ELAP, and just build off something I said earlier, which is that, I said white folks don't have a lived experiences of racism. Well, they don't have a lived experiences of being on the receiving end of racism, but they absolutely have a lived experiences of racism, but in that dominant, superior position. And so a white person in a rural area, for example, it does start at a disadvantage because they don't have that clear, direct role because their communities have been structurally created to be white. So they're not that they're untouched by racism, but they have the disadvantage. I think that was really great and I wanted to touch on. For folks who have registered today, you will get an email from us on a way to listen to this webinar again. You'll get more information about REJI and the toolkit if folks are interested. You'll get more information about us on this call, on the webinar, and the PowerPoint slides, a bunch of different resources for folks to stay connected and be engaged in this work. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today, and we will see you all at the next one. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Be well. And thank you, Ada and Jen. We're not on camera right now.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you.